Good morning, everyone. Dear colleagues, dear students, dear panelists, on behalf of the Human Rights Center Antonio Papisca and the UNESCO Chair in Human Rights, Democracy and Peace of the University of Padua, I have the honor and the great pleasure to warmly welcome each of you to the International Conference on the Consequences of War and Their Interdependence, bringing human security back to the global political agenda. I'm especially grateful to the keynote speakers, Wolfgang Benedict, Professor Emeritus of International Law at the University of Graz, Karen Smith, Professor of International Relations at the London School of Economics and Political Science, Jan Frey, Professor of International Environment Policy and Environmental Law at the Australian National University and United Nations Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of the human rights in the context of climate change. I'm especially grateful also to the keynote speaker, Jean Fabre, United Nations Task Force on Social and Solidarity Economy, Khairat Abdrakhmanov, High Commissioner on National Minority of the OCE, and Jihad Namour, St. Joseph University of Beirut Academic Coordinator of the Arab Master for Democratization and Human Rights. A special thanks to the institutes that have cooperated in the organization management of conference research panels, Human Rights Consortium of the University of London, School of Global Studies of the University of Gothenburg, UNESCO Chair in Human Rights and Human Security of the University of Graz and the University of Wrocław. My deep gratitude to Elena Pariotti, Professor of Human Rights and Director of the Department of Political Science, Law and International Studies for the constant support, and of course to Pietro de Perini, Professor of Human Rights and International Politics, for the great work done to organize this conference. A warm welcome to the students of the Bachelor Degree Program in Political Science, International Relations, and Human Rights, the Master Degree Program in Human Rights and Multi-Level Governance, and the International Ph.D. Program in Human Rights, Society, and Multi-Level Governance. The conference is promoted in the framework of the celebration for the 40th anniversary of the establishment of the University of Padua Human Rights Center Antonio Papisca. Our Vice-Rector, Professor Monica Fedeli, returned tonight from the state and will join us later. So let me add just a few words on the conference that is now inaugurating. 74 years after the adoption of the Universal Declaration, human rights values are today under attack more intensely than at any period in recent decades. Violence, wars, terrorism, rearmament, autocratic and dictatorial tendencies are increasingly shaking the human condition in the grip of insecurity. The universal and regional human rights protection systems, together with the multilateral institutions within which they operate, are overloaded of inputs, while states do not provide necessary resources to support and strengthen them. The human rights machinery, both at the local and national level, has been one of the first sectors to be negatively affected by cuts resulting from the economic crisis. Attacks against the human rights defender are a global emergency. All over the world, and organizations promoting social justice and human rights face repression and securitization with unprecedented attacks on their legitimacy and security. Recently, the European Parliament, the Fundamental Rights Agency, the Council of Europe, and the United Nations have denounced with great concern the progressive shrinking of civil society spaces in Europe and worldwide. According to the CIPRI report, armed conflict in at least 46 states are expected in 2021. In the same year, the global military expenditure grew for the 7th consecutive year, exceeding $2 trillion. 9 states possess over 12,000 nuclear warheads. Are those, is mine? No. It's mine, I'm sorry. It is a war without peace. It is a war without peace. After the end of the Second World War, a number of women and men from different countries tried to outlaw war by creating the United Nations and promoting a new international order based on the principle of the equal dignity of the human person and peoples. At the same time, in Europe, other political leaders united in an effort to avert further catastrophes, convinced that the absolute sovereignty of state was at the root of war, envisioned a united and solidary Europe, and initiated the construction of the European Union by creating the European Coal and Steel Community. The reality of our days describes, unfortunately, a very different world. A world at war dominated by the clash of the most diverse national and economic interests. Instead of seizing the extraordinary opportunities offered by the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Berlin Wall, the choice was made to pursue the design of a hierarchical world order based on the law of the strongest and the supposed right to make war, institutional and economic deregulation, and unbridled competition. The Russian aggression of Ukraine is a child of this global war pattern that now threatens us ever more closely. The war in Ukraine tells us once again that international peace and social internal peace are strongly intertwined. The Russian invasion of Ukraine and its dramatic escalation forces us to make a common effort to stop the war. Never before have we all had to feel committed to the difficult search for the path to peace. Peace is life, and care for life is peace. Care is therefore the new name of peace. Positive peace is a way of living together with the others, respecting each other's dignity and human rights. Positive peace is that stated in Article 28 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a social international order in which all human rights for all can be fully realized. So, peace is work, food, water, health, education, dignity, equality, justice, respect, fraternity, non-violence, freedom, dialogue, democracy, solidarity, inclusion. In the report, Human Security Now, it is stated, human security broadens the focus from the security of borders to the lives of people and community inside and across those borders. I conclude. The norms contained in the UN Charter and international law prohibit war and oblige states to negotiate to resolve their dispute. The path of negotiation is the only possible way to stop the war and rebuild peace. There is no just violence and there is no just war. Wars constitute a criminal sequence that has the characteristic of vicious circle. War calls war. In order for the cycle to be broken, the military attribute of the nation state must come to an end. Democratic structures of world governance must be established. The system of collective security envisaged in the United Nations Charter must be put into operation. The United Nations Agenda 2030 must be realized. Today, unlike yesterday, there are instruments to resolve conflict peacefully. They are set out in the United Nations Charter itself: negotiations, mediation, conciliation, arbitration, recourse to regional organization or agreement, and so on. Pope Francis, in the encyclical Fratelli Tutti, wrote, "Here is a need to ensure the uncontested rule of law and tireless recourse to negotiation, mediation, and arbitration, as proposed by the United Nations Charter, which constitute truly a fundamental juridical norm. The United Nations and other multilateral organizations must be strengthened and democratized if we are to pursue the institutional and non-violent path to peace." So, with this international conference, policy action-oriented, we intend to give our contribution to outline the scheme of peace to be placed as an alternative to the scheme of war. In other words, to overcome state security and to achieve human security. Thank you for your attention. And now I have the pleasure to give the floor to Elena Pariotti, Director of the Department of Political Science, Law, and International Studies. Thank you, Elena.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad and honored to welcome all of you on behalf of the Department of Political Science, Law, and International Studies. Since from the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the department organized lots of initiatives, conferences, workshops to understand the causes of this invasion, to understand how international law could have been avoided these crises. But this is the first initiative the department has supported, dealing with the consequences of this war and the consequences in terms of human security. And of course, as Marco Mascia has brilliantly underlined, of course, this is a topic that strongly needs to be addressed, also in order to find a solution to this crisis, also in order to weigh all the issues and all the values, the international values for the international community that are at stake, that are strong at stake. Therefore, I also want to thank all the partners in this initiative, in this conference, starting from the Human Rights Center, Antonio Papisca, and the Human Rights Consortium of the University of London, the UNESCO Chair, Human Rights and Human Security at the University of Graz, the Institute of International Studies of the University of Wrocław in Poland, and the School of Global Studies, the University of Gothenburg. So this is very important to stress that many different institutions around Europe are involved in this initiative and this conference. So thank you very much for this initiative, and I want to wish you a fruitful conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elena. Thank you. Now I give the floor to Professor Alberto Lanzavecchia. He is a coordinator of our PhD program, Human Rights Society, Multi-Level Governance. Alberto.
Stand up, otherwise I can't see you all. You are so many in this very beautiful room. Dear all, and thank you, the organizer, Professor Mascia, for having invited me as an opening speech for this very important conference. The PhD program in Human Rights Society and Multi-Level Governance is a 3-year interdisciplinary academic program offered by the University of Padova, and it's run by Human Rights Center Antonio Papisca. PhD graduates gain a multi- and interdisciplinary profile in human rights studies with the distinctive competencies in the area of politics, law, sociology, psychology, economics, and philosophy. The program includes learning, research, and training activities in a global perspective. However, human rights move alongside with human activities and society, and yet they are not idle, they're not eternal. And the opening speech from my fellow colleagues, the director of Human Rights Center, underlined that they are under attack. The more the inequalities, the more the climate change is dividing territories between those who people are no longer ready to live there, and they have to move somewhere. And the more the dictator gain power, gaining capital for their own interest, the more the human rights are threatened. And this is the reality we are facing in the last years, where inequalities, climate change, and dictators are gaining power against people. So if it is so, we need to widen our perspective on actual, nowadays, human rights threats, and deepen our knowledge on causes and solutions through a solid research. This is why I wish to all our PhD candidates I see here, but I guess also some our fellow researchers and scholars in this room, a very fruitful work, because it's supposed to be a policy-oriented conference. So the result, I hope, must have an application outside. Otherwise, the situation will never ever change. So I wish you a very fruitful work during the International Conference on Consequences of War and Their Interdependencies. And I leave the floor to my fellow colleagues, Pietro de Perini, for a short introduction on how this conference is organized. Thank you so much to all.
Okay, thank you. Good morning and welcome everyone here in the Archivio Antico and online as well to the annual University of Padova International Human Rights Research Conference, which, as mentioned in the previous intervention before me, we have decided to articulate around two broad, interconnected and inescapable goals. So the first goal is analyzing and discussing the multiple consequences that in an interdependence perspective, war, in fact, all ongoing wars are having on everyone's fundamental needs and opportunities. And the second is reflecting on what could be the main initiatives, good practices, and strategies to shift towards a shared approach to security, which really places the human persons and their needs at the core of international agency. So the conference tries to integrate a more conceptual and heuristic perspective with a more action and policy-oriented approach, as it was mentioned, and my task is to provide a short general introduction to this frame. So all wars, all violent international and internal conflicts that are dotting our planet are, first of all, of course, a catastrophe for those living in the conflict zone and those related to them, a continuous tragedy marked by loss of life, systematic displacement, destruction, denial of basic needs and fundamental rights, and widespread fear. And in addition, as we all know, and as it was mentioned, in this increasingly, or rather extremely interdependent world, such tragic and destabilizing consequences are not happening in a vacuum. They cannot be insulated. On the contrary, they further strengthen the insecurity of all people and communities, feeding into a wealth of failing, international attempts to collectively and responsibly address the urgent global challenges of our times. And the consequences of the ongoing war in Ukraine are the most recent, shocking, and evident example of this process, but not necessarily the only one. Indeed, as we are eager to adopt a global perspective, we may agree that we did not need the outbreak of this shameful war and of its current escalation to observe that the well-being of people, individuals and communities, their dignity and empowerment have been set aside for some time now by many in the international community. We have witnessed national egotism in the management of the pandemic and of the still precarious recoveries from it. The challenges of climate change are at their peak, despite vague commitments and amid newly emerging tensions and divisions among states. Human rights, was mentioned, are systematically under attack everywhere in the world, and sometimes the international consensus on them seems to be crumbling. Conflicts are widespread and increasing, while the space for civil society is shrinking and contested in every angle of this planet, damaging one of the most efficient interstices we dispose of to make things change from the bottom up. States themselves are increasingly divided and polarized, affecting residual viability opportunities for true multilateralism, which can only be that of the United Nations system and of the still revolutionary principle of its charter, starting from the proscription of war, the obligation to use peaceful means to settle international disputes, and the promotion of human rights. So, building further on these developments, the magnitude of the war in Ukraine has come to constitute a major, terrible blow to these staggering global efforts, which were struggling, to use the word of UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, were struggling to strengthening global governance for the sake of present and coming generation, and securing a world where everyone can thrive in peace, dignity, and equality on a healthy planet. What we see, on the contrary, is a shift in the perception of what are the actual global urgency, leading world leaders to eventually neglect human, social, and environmental priorities of our era, which appear to be significantly sacrificed to an anachronistic pursuit of the material interest of few powerful nations, directly threatening human dignity and human fulfillment. Of course, we consequences, and our distinguished guest speaker this morning and tomorrow morning, and the researchers and practitioners who will enliven the panels that we have set up with the cooperation with our partner of the University of Graz, London, and Wrocław this year, will help us exploring them, both focusing on a number of crucial dimensions of their dependence, from climate change to the effects on migrants and refugees, from the economic and social consequences of war to the impact on minority rights, and looking at the responses of key international actors, including the choices being made by the European Union. Moreover, in addition to observing, analyzing, and critically discussing the causes and consequences of this disheartening situation, which we try to outline, we also need to consider how we can abandon this rapid before touching the bottom, to understand how to recall a very passionate speech that the great Federico Mayor recently gave at the UNESCO conference. We can use our strength and determination to revert the global trend towards enhancing the reason of force and make the force of reason eventually prevail. Security is one of the global common goods on which we can work to achieve such an ambitious but inescapable goal. Not merely traditional state security, exclusionary, and evidently not sufficient to guarantee our security, and which anyway should be intended as a direct reflection of the perception of the security of a state's population. To achieve a radical shift, the radical shift that we are pursuing today, we must understand and build security as fundamentally people-centered, multidimensional, interconnected, and universal. And the principle that people and their well-being, their development and rights, their freedom from want and from fear, should be at the core of the efforts for the international security is, as we know, not new at all. It has for long been pursued by academia, global civil society, and by a wealth of multilateral organizations and institutions. It suffices to think at the precursory contribution of the Conference for Security and Cooperation in Europe, Third Basket, and of course, the very initiative of UNDP, which formally introduced the concept of human security in the mid-90s. The already mentioned 2003 report by the UN-mandated Commission on Human Security stressed that human security means protecting fundamental freedoms, which are the essence of life, that human security means protecting people from severe and pervasive threats and situations using processes that build on people's social environment, on people's strengths and aspiration, that human security means creating political, social, environmental, economic, and cultural systems that together give people the building blocks of survival, livelihood, and dignity. This is one among the many concomitant efforts which try to elaborate and operationalize this concept. Some were even more ambitious, others conceptualize it more narrowly. Empirical evidence, however, constantly remind us that despite commonly agreed, even in 2012 in a General Assembly resolution as the right of people to live in freedom and dignity, free from poverty and despair, human security was never fundamentally considered by the majority of states at the core of their approaches to foreign policy making, at least out of lip service and declaratory politics. So some could even observe that the most compelling debate on human security has lost its momentum in global discourse. However, looking at the plans and norms on which the international community, governments, institutions, and civil society have currently agreed to commit their energies, such momentum seems to have not faded at all. We have ongoing plans, we have built expertise, we have agreed principles and goals, and we have vision to advance it. And the best example of what I'm saying, I believe, is the Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development, which, as we know, was defined through the largest process of consultation ever in UN history and was adopted unanimously. The agenda, in particular, emphasized among its objectives a world free of poverty, hunger, disease, and want, free of fear and violence, with equitable and universal access to quality education, healthcare, and social protection, to safe drinking water and sanitation where food is sufficient, safe, affordable, and nutrition, where habits are safe, resilient, and sustainable, and where there is universal access to affordable, reliable, and sustainable energy. So, in addition to be the most ambitious global commitment to inclusive, sustainable, and human development today, and in addition to represent what many practitioners and fellow colleagues understand as an operational plan to advance human rights, the agenda is therefore an agreed and updated blueprint to fulfill human security, and is pursued through a stronger gender equality dimension, which is as well a vital component of any serious human security agenda. The big challenge is, of course, how to ensure that the Agenda 2030 is the true priority of all members of the international community. Because personally, I don't see any compatibility between the pursuit of its vision, goals and targets and choices that directly or indirectly sustain wars or neglect the stubborn commitment of diplomacy, dialogue, and mediation, which is needed if we want to spare people in area of conflict or beyond from the catastrophic consequences of war on human security. At this conference today, we have a heterogeneous combination of professional, geographical, and disciplinary perspectives and background, which will allow us to discuss ideas, tools, and possible paths to define and support the shift we are pursuing. As was mentioned, never as today must we all feel committed to the difficult search for the way to peace and putting our expertise, knowledge, passion, and effort at the service of this goal. I truly wish that this conference will be an opportunity to make a step towards in this ambitious and necessary direction, that each of you will find fruitful insights, ideas, stimuli, and networking opportunities to this end. Thank you very much and enjoy the conference.
Thank you, Pietro. And now I ask to Paolo De Stefani to chair the opening plenary session. Paolo.
Morning. Welcome. I would invite Professor Benedek and Professor Fry and Professor Smith. That should be somewhere in the air. Okay. Closer to the microphone. Okay. So good morning. I'm not sure whether Karen Smith has joined us. I think she did. Okay. Yeah, I see you. Welcome. So my name is Paolo De Stefani. I teach international law in this university. I'm glad to chair, let's say, this first panel in this conference. So a few words to introduce the first session that we start now. So the title of the session is The Consequences of War and Their Interdependence. The Consequences of War. This is a title remindful of another title that came to my mind, which is the title of a movie by Paolo Sorrentino, The Consequences of Love. Le conseguenze dell'amore, a movie of some years ago, quite famous. Well, almost famous. Okay. And it was the story of a mafia accountant who was stuck in an hotel in Switzerland because the mafia wanted him to supervise some operations that they were doing in Switzerland, of course, some banks. And he had a swift encounter with a barmaid, a girl in the hotel. And in this swift moment, he realized that love was a possibility for him. And this actually allowed him to cut his links with the mafia, face his boss, betray his boss, and eventually get punished by the mafia, by the mob, and killed eventually. So for him, love was a fact that produced a change, a radical change in his life. Not the facts of love, but the very possibility of love, the potentiality of love was a game-changing fact for him. And there is a scenery, and there is a scene in the movie when he, as a sort of pawn of love, offered the girl a sport car. You know, when you live in certain environment, you don't realize what really women need. So he proposed her to have a sport car of $1,000. And she said, no, thank you, because this would alter, would change our relationship. I don't want to change our relationship so far. So love alters the reality, altered the characters in this movie. Love is a fact and has consequences. And we are now asked this morning to reflect about the consequences of another fact, another reality of our world, which is not love. In this case, is war. War, too, is a fact and has consequences. The aim of this session is not much to dispute about causes and features of war, the war in Ukraine and the many other wars that are surrounding our world today. Our attempt is to reflect about the consequences of what is happening.
of the violence which is taking place in so many parts of the world. And this will be done with a focus on 3 scenarios. One scenario is scenarios or projects, if you like, projects that are disrupted or going to be disrupted or potentially disrupted by the fact of wars. The first scenario is the human security project. The second scenario is the EU project. Ukraine in particular is affecting this big project that we started decades ago and that is now, facing very hard times. And the third scenario is sustainability and the fight against the global change, the global warm. So reflecting about consequences implies that what is done cannot be undone. So in legal terminology, let's say restitutio in integrum is not possible. A complete return to the situation quo ante is not feasible. Talking about the consequences of the war necessarily requires realizing that something tragic has happened and is happening, something that cannot be undone. However, consequences also implies adopting a forward-looking attitude as compared to a retrospective approach. The retrospective approach which is dominant, I would say, in today's public discourse and also in scholarship. The analysis of conflict causes and dynamics should never be detached study of their consequences. Both those consequences that are inevitable, but also those that can be avoided for the future and whose impact can be mitigated. The war is a fact, unfortunately, but its consequences are something that we still can carve and shape for the future, at least partially. This, however, requires from us a certain bit of creativity, of imagination. Again, in the movie of Sorrentino, the very first scene, showing this mafia accountant alone in this Swiss hotel, the voice that accompanies this scene says that after spending years alone in this situation, one can leave the capacity of imagining, of going beyond flat facts. And actually, we sometimes feel like we cannot go beyond flat facts. So the capacity to imagine a new future, a future which is radically different from what we have under our eyes now. But unfortunately, we are not alone in a Swiss hotel. We are sharing this predicament with many other people, and some of the other peoples are here. The first mate I would like to give the floor now is Professor Wolfgang Benedek, a friend of the Human Rights Center, I would say. Wolfgang Benedek is emeritus professor at the University of Graz. He has taught international law with a focus on human rights, human security, international economic law. He was director and the founder of the Institute of International Law and International Relations and the European Training and Research Center for Human Rights and Democracy, the ETC, at the University of Graz. He is a lecturer at the Vienna Diplomatic Academy and at the European Master Programs on Human Rights and Democracy in Venice and on Human Rights and Democracy in Sarajevo. He was OSCE rapporteur on Chechnya, on Belarus, and recently on Ukraine. Among his recent publications, I'd like to mention Russia and the European Court of Human Rights with Laurie Marxo, freedom of expression in the internet, publication of the Council of Europe, transnational terrorism, organized crime and peace building with Vojin Dmitrievich, among others, and also the common interest in international law with Kuhn the Fighter. So Wolfgang, thank you for coming. You have the floor.
Yeah, thank you. It's always great to be back to Padua, and it's nice to be in this magnificent room, which is unique in the world. So Padua has very much to provide us with, and the introduction has already shown also that from the thought you are propagating, you have a big contribution to make. Now, my topic is the war in Ukraine from a human security perspective, and this is a topic which is very close to my heart, I have to say, because as Paolo mentioned, I had the opportunity to chair a mission, a fact-finding mission under the Moscow mechanism to Ukraine. Was the first international mission where we looked into violations of international humanitarian law and human rights. And since that time, I'm very much involved in these topics through a number of follow-up activities. Only tomorrow I have to travel to Berlin, where we are having a conference on the role of civil society in this context, and I'm going to meet the Nobel Prize winners of this year, which, as you know, are from civil society, but I will come back to that. Now, as we are all aware, since 24th of February 2022, Russia is leading a war of aggression against Ukraine, which gained independence from Russia in 1991. Let me state some historical facts which are not without importance in this context. Because of the nuclear arms stationed at the time on Ukrainian territory, it became in 1991 the third largest nuclear power, but decided to renounce to nuclear weapons, which were consequently returned to the Russian Federation to be disabled. In return, the Budapest Memorandum on Security Assurances in connection with Ukraine's accession to the Treaty on Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, signed in 1994 by Russia, the United States, the United Kingdom, and Ukraine, with reference to the Charter of Helsinki of 1975, guaranteed the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Ukraine, as well as the non-use of nuclear weapons against Ukraine, except in the case of self-defense. This was reconfirmed in the Treaty of Friendship in 1997 with Russia. However, as generally known, all three commitments were broken since 2014, and in particular since February this year. Some of the weapons returned are used to attack or to threaten Ukraine today. Among the reasons given for the attack on Ukraine, President Putin denied that Ukraine is a nation and therefore also its right to existence. In this contribution, I will first characterize the war in Ukraine from an international legal perspective, and then introduce the main elements of the human security perspective in order to apply it in the third step to the war in Ukraine. Finally, I will draw some tentative conclusions. Now, let me start with the characterization of the war in Ukraine. from an international law perspective. While the Russian annexation of Crimea in 2014 and its support to rebel movements in the Donbass since that time, leading to an undeclared war, which till 2021 already had taken the lives of more than 13,000 people, among them more than 3,000 civilians. The Russian invasion of Ukraine from February till October of this year is estimated to have taken the lives of estimated more than 60,000 people, among them about 10% civilians, but most likely more. A recent US report estimated that more than 100,000 Russian soldiers have been killed or wounded, and the casualties on the Ukrainian side are also very high. About 15 million persons were displaced, of those some 5 million abroad. Whole cities like Hostomel or Mariupol were largely destroyed. The lack of progress of Russia in the field has led it to an air campaign against mostly civilian infrastructure, which so far destroyed or damaged some 40% of Ukraine's electricity, heating and water installations, which is a major war crime. As documented by several fact-finding missions in the context of OSCE and the United Nations, among them the one chaired by me in March 2022, the Russian invasion resulted in numerous war crimes like the crime of aggression itself, systematic violations of international humanitarian law, crimes against humanity and genocidal acts like the deportation of parts of the population to Russia, among them many children, partly to very remote areas of Russia. The main principles of international humanitarian law, namely the principles of distinction, allowing only to attack military targets, the principle of proportionality, requesting not to use unnecessary force or inadequate weapons to meet the military targets, and the principle of precaution in order to avoid incidental loss of civilian life, injury of civilians, and damage to civilian objects have been largely ignored. As a consequence, the loss of civilian lives and destruction of civilian objects go far beyond the military purposes, and in certain cases, like the attacks on civilian infrastructure, hospitals, schools, or universities, have even become targets as well. For example, the use of anti-personnel landmines prohibited by the Ottawa Convention of 1997, or on cluster munitions prohibited by a convention of 2008, to which, however, Russia and Ukraine are not parties, the use of imprecise, of incendiary weapons, of vacuum bombs in violation of the above-mentioned principles have created unnecessary suffering among the military and the civilians. As shown already by the first international fact-finding report under the Moscow mechanism of OSCE, presented to its Permanent Council in April this year, to be confirmed by a second report in July of this year, and the recent report by the United Nations Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine of October this year, practically all rules of international humanitarian law have been ignored or violated by the Russian aggression, while there have also been a few violations from the Ukrainian side. In particular, there have been attacks on specially protected institutions, extrajudicial killings, torture and rape, mistreatment of prisoners of war and detainees, lack of respect for the dead, violations of the obligations of an occupying power, for example, by the large-scale deportation of people, among them many women and children. The bombing of the Mariupol maternity hospital and theater, with hundreds of people dead, exemplify the manifold direct attacks on civilians. The violations of international humanitarian law are further aggravated by the violations of basic human rights, in particular in the occupied areas, which affected all basic civil and political human rights like life, liberty and security, fair trial, freedom of expression or assembly, but also the economic, social and cultural rights like education, health, food and water. Vulnerable persons like the elderly, women, children, or persons with disabilities were particularly affected, as were LGBTI persons or members of minorities. Ukrainian mayors, journalists, or civil society leaders in occupied areas were subject to particular persecution. Summarizing, our report found a consistent pattern of violations of international humanitarian law and human rights. These findings were also confirmed and complemented, as already mentioned, by later reports. Now let me elaborate a bit on what are the main elements of a human security perspective. The human security perspective focuses on the security of the human person. Like Marco has already mentioned, instead of state security and the security of people matters, which however does not have to be a contradiction in a democratic system. International relations and international law are to adopt a human-centered approach. The basic pillars are freedom from fear and freedom from want, together with the dignity and empowerment of the human person, in particular vulnerable groups, which are in the center of attention. Threats to human security can be manifold. UNDP in 1994 distinguished 7 main categories, UNESCO later many more. The report of the Independent Commission on Human Security, already mentioned this morning, of 2003, initiated by Japan, entitled Human Security Now, Protecting and Empowering People, focused on violent conflicts and other threats like forced migration, poverty, or health. Japan is still the main promoter of the concept of human security, leading a group of friends of human security in the United Nations and supporting the United Nations Trust Fund for Human Security, from which projects in the field of violent conflicts, natural disasters, and sustainable development are supported. In 2012, the UN General Assembly adopted a common understanding of human security, which is to focus on widespread and cross-cutting threats to the survival of peoples, their livelihood and dignity. Addressing related vulnerabilities, the understanding emphasizes that the linkages between peace, development, and human rights need to be taken into account. The principles of the UN Charter, like respect for state sovereignty, territorial integrity, and non-interference, are to be respected. Generally, the human security approach intends to strengthen multilateral solutions through the United Nations and other international organizations, as already alluded to by Marco and Pietro, based on a multi-stakeholder approach, partnering with civil society in particular, which should be empowered. By identifying and addressing root causes of security threats, the prevention of conflicts should be promoted. Human security and human rights are closely intertwined. The concept of human security stands for a holistic, problem-oriented approach which crosses disciplinary lines and gives particular attention to the local dimension, which in the last years has gained in relevance also for human rights. With regard to the application of the human security perspective on people caught in violent conflict, as the Human Security Report calls it, reference needs to be made to the UN Charter, which outlawed war as a means to solve conflicts and established a system of collective security instead, which, as we all know, has its limitations. In order to protect people in violent conflicts, the importance of international humanitarian law and human rights are emphasized without excluding, however, the use of military force. The use of weapons which cause unnecessary suffering or victims are to be banned. As mentioned, the Convention banning anti-personnel landmines of 1997 was a landmark of the human security approach driven at the time by broad multi-stakeholder coalition. Particular attention has to be devoted to vulnerable groups as women and children. Indeed, the UN Security Council has made the protection of children in violent conflict one of its key concerns by adopting pertinent resolutions. On the human rights side, the Convention on the Rights of the Child also calls for the protection of children in armed conflict. For people displaced by violent conflict, safe havens are to be made available. For the perpetrators of violations, international accountability is to be provided. The International Criminal Court is a crucial institution in this respect, but I will come back to it in a moment. Now let me apply this human security perspective to the war in Ukraine. By invading its neighbor, the Russian Federation committed a breach of the major principles and obligations of the United Nations, OSCE, and international law. To the crime of aggression come massive violations of international humanitarian law and human rights, some of which constitute crimes against humanity, defined as a widespread and systematic attack directed against the civilian population, as already mentioned. Consequently, not only the state security of Ukraine case, however, largely coincides with national security. However, the human security perspective allows to put the spotlight on the threats towards civilians, in particular vulnerable groups. The laws of war, in particular the Fourth Geneva Convention of 1949, to which Russia and Ukraine are parties, were made to limit the suffering and to protect civilians, in particular the weakest parts of society. The organization to oversee these conventions is the International Committee for the Red Cross. However, its work normally avoids publicity in order to get access to the people affected, like prisoners of war. Therefore, the ICRC is not reporting on these violations of IHL, although it might have the best insights. As war times are usually characterized by contradicting information and propaganda, professional independent fact-finding is most important. In the case of the war in Ukraine, as mentioned, several fact-finding missions were established by OSCE and also the Human Rights Council of the United Nations, which, by the way, also has a human rights monitoring mission on the ground already since 1994, which helped us also in our work. The Moscow mechanism has been agreed already in 1991 and allows to establish a fact-finding mission on the request of the country where the investigation takes place, consisting of a mission of 3 experts, which have to produce a report within only 3 weeks. There is no need for a consensus, as in most other matters in OSCE. The mission is fully independent, and even OSCE, or more specifically, ODIHR, the Office of Democratic Institutions and Human Rights in Warsaw, which services the mission, provides only technical support. Among the sources, civil society organizations play a major role because they are on the ground, collect information, and can connect the mission to persons to be interviewed. Of particular importance for our report were also international human rights NGOs like Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch, and in particular investigative NGOs like Bellingcat, which have a special analytical expertise. It might not be possible to investigate most of the alleged violations, but at least some major ones, whereas the information from various sources may allow to identify a pattern of the facts. Accordingly, already after the first weeks, it became clear that in spite of the Russian assurances not to touch at civilians or civilian institutions, this indeed happened in a systematic way. In the meantime, these findings unfortunately have been confirmed many times. As our mandate was to review alleged violations of IHL and human rights, this meant also that we had a human security focus in our approach. Accordingly, the report speaks about violations of the rules of war with a particular concern for the rules on the protection of civilians and civilian institutions. Special attention is given to vulnerable groups as identified already above. Children in armed conflict have become a particular concern of the United Nations by the Security Council since many years, as shown in its resolution since 1999. More recently, a resolution in 2018 provided for a framework for mainstreaming protection, rights, well-being, and empowerment of children throughout the conflict cycle. Only in July of this year, the Security Council held an open debate on children in armed conflict, where it was announced that on the initiative of the Secretary General, Ukraine was listed as a country of concern, triggering a daily monitoring of gross violations against children in Ukraine by the UN bodies. The UN Independent International Mission of Inquiry, in its preliminary report of October this year, found that children have become the victims of the full spectrum of violations, including indiscriminate attacks, torture, and rape, suffering the predictable psychological consequences. Among those violations are also the deportation of large numbers of children by the Russian authorities to Russia and the adoption of some of those Ukrainian children by Russian parents, which is also a topic of a recent report of Amnesty International on forcible transfers from the occupied areas, which do constitute a war crime. Regarding the protection of women in armed conflict, the UN Security Council has also adopted important resolutions like the one on gender-related violence of 2010, which provides for an accountability system for conflict-related sexual violence, late in 2013 also, dealing with humanitarian aid to ensure access to sexual and reproductive health services, for example, to address pregnancies resulting from rape. Another group in need of special protection are journalists and the media. The United Nations, OSCE, and the Council of Europe have adopted special protection measures to improve the safety of journalists and media workers in conflict zones. The international fact-finding reports, however, show that this group remains at risk and sometimes is even deliberately targeted. In view of the fact that in the case of the Russian aggression, the Security Council could not fulfill its function against one of its permanent members, the UN General Assembly was requested to deal with the matter in an emergency special session, which resulted in several key resolutions, like the one of March 22 on humanitarian consequences of the aggression against Ukraine, demanding that civilians, including humanitarian personnel, journalists, and persons in vulnerable situations, including women and children, be fully protected, as well as respect and protect of the medical and humanitarian personnel and of civilian infrastructure critical to the delivery of essential services. The United Nations thus have practically adopted a human security approach without calling it by that name. The UN also played a major role in negotiating a deal on allowing for food exports, thus contributing to global food security. Recently, the Nobel Prize Peace was awarded to the civil society of Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine as represented by Ales Bialyatsky from the human rights organization Vyasna Belarus, with whom I cooperated during my report 2 years ago. Now he is in prison since last year. The Human Rights NGO Memorial, again, important organization for my work in Chechnya, now banned in Russia since last year, and the Ukrainian Human Rights Organization Center for Civil Liberties. As the reasoning says, those organizations have made outstanding efforts to document war crimes, human rights abuses, and abuses of power in their respective countries. In my reports under the Moscow mechanism, I have closely worked with most of these organizations and learned to appreciate the important and delicate work. The Nobel Peace Prize can be considered as an important empowerment of the work of civil society suffering from repression and war conditions. On similar lines, the Sakharov Prize for Freedom of Thought of the European Parliament of this year was awarded to the brave people of Ukraine, as represented by their president-elected leaders and civil society, mentioning specifically medical evacuation units or the Yellow Ribbon civil resistance movement in the occupied territories. The ceremony will take place on 14th December this year in Strasbourg. Regarding the Council of Europe, the Parliamentary Assembly has awarded its Václav Havel Human Rights Prize for outstanding civil society action in support of human rights to the Russian opposition leader and journalist Vladimir Kara-Murza, founder of the Russian Anti-War Committee, who has been imprisoned in April of this year by the Russian regime. By emphasizing the role of the people as well as civil society or journalists as the most important non-state actors, again, a human security perspective becomes visible. In this case, the security of the state defending itself against an illegal aggression and of the people shouldering the burden of defense are almost identical, while the focus is different as it mainly concerns the humanitarian dimensions of the war. In the awarding of the Nobel Peace Prize and other distinctions mentioned, the close relationship between human security and human rights once again plays an important role. Human security is the wider concept than human rights, and it is also more based on policies than on human rights law. But human rights are an indispensable element of human security, as can be seen from those reports already mentioned. Furthermore, a proper human security perspective is also concerned with peace building after the war, in which people have to matter once again. A sustainable peace will have to address the root causes of the war as well. The growing Ukrainian nationalism as different from patriotism, which attacks the Russian culture and language, is not helpful for a future reconciliation and may support the Russian allegations of discrimination of Russians, which were not justified before the war. Part of the peace-building process in the context of human security has to be to provide justice to the victims and accountability of perpetrators. The decision to create an international criminal court by the Rome Conference in 1998, which led to its establishment in The Hague in 2002, was a major achievement in this direction. Based on 2 declarations by Ukraine and the referral of 43 state parties, the ICC is already investigating war crimes in Ukraine. However, it can only address the tip of the iceberg, in view of the fact that the General Prosecutor of Ukraine has already opened some 40,000 cases of alleged war crimes. Therefore, Eurojust and the EU Genocide Network of Investigators and Prosecutors, which also deals with war crimes and crimes against humanity, is supporting Ukraine in this endeavor, as well as several other national jurisdictions to prevent situations of impunity. Let me come to final conclusions. While the concept of human security has lost some of its attractiveness in the last 20 years due to a resovereignization in international relations, which also resulted in a backlash, already mentioned, for human rights and multilateralism altogether, it is still of value for the analysis of threats to the human person and for showing ways how to deal with those on a priority basis. The war in Ukraine also provides an example for the continuing relevance of the concept. A human security perspective allows to better understand and address the related humanitarian challenges. Still, we see hesitations in the use of the concept by international organizations like OSCE, which prefer to speak of comprehensive security, while the human dimension is an important pillar in its work. The fact that a major publishing house has found it interesting to solicit a research handbook on international law and human security, which has just appeared under the editorship of Gerd Oberleitner, present in this room. And please have a look at the book afterwards. Etwa Elga Publishing is the publisher. That can also be taken as confirmation that there is renewed interest in the human security perspective. Also for the recent and hopefully overcome COVID-19 pandemic, the human security approach has been useful in addressing the problems of international health security. Finally, the main merit of the human security perspective remains that it reminds all actors that the final purpose of all activities in the field of security is to benefit the human person. This should be a main criterion in decisions on the objectives and means of security policies and be strengthened by international agreements limiting the use of force, respecting human rights, or providing for basic services, allowing the human person to live in dignity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Wolfgang, for reminding us that human security is still at work. It's a project that has not been completely abandoned, and even though the situations around us, create a lot of challenges for those who are engaged in this project. Now I'm pleased to give the floor to Professor Karen Smith, whose intervention has a title, The Shifting Approach of the EU Between Normative Power and Strategic Autonomy. Karen Smith is a professor of international relations at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Her main area of research is the international relations of the European Union. And she has written extensively on the formulation and implementation of common EU foreign policies. She has examined the EU's pursuit of ethical foreign policy goals, such as promoting human rights and democracy, policymaking within European states regarding genocide. For over a decade, she has also analyzed the EU-UN relations, and more recently has extended her research to consider the role of other political and regional groups in the UN diplomacy. She's now working on projects on women in foreign policy, foreign policy making and diplomacy, and on the role of emotions in the EU foreign policy making. She teaches a course on the EU in the world and supervises PhD students working on EU foreign relations. Among recent publications that reflect this research interest just mentioned, the European Union Foreign Policy in a Changing World, sort of manual, Genocide and the Europeans, 2010, Emotions and European Union Foreign Policy, Missing in Analysis, Women in Foreign Policy Making, and also recently the European Union at the Human Rights Council speaking with one voice, but having little influence. Okay, dear Professor Smith, you have the floor. And
I think the
just in this moment we had okay.
Okay, yeah, I think there was just a freezing. Thank you very much for asking me to speak to this conference. I'm sorry that I could not be there in what looks like an absolutely magnificent hall. I do wish I could be there, but I cannot. I also have to apologize. I have a dog who has, in the past 2.5 years, become incredibly jealous of Zoom. So she might occasionally interrupt my talk. So apologies in advance for that. I am going to focus much more on EU human rights policy at the United Nations. I'll explain why in just a minute. But mostly that is because I am also working on this particular topic as well. So I will focus sort of more on the normative power aspect of the European Union within an extremely difficult geopolitical context on human rights. I'll share some slides as well. I hope that goes well. So we might fiddle around with that for just a bit when I do start sharing slides. Russia's invasion of Ukraine and Chinese implicit support for it has revealed an increasingly polarized geopolitical context. My focus here is on geopolitical tension in the context of the global human rights regime and its core institution, the United Nations Human Rights Council. The key question for my talk is, how is the EU navigating between its declared strong support for a robust human rights regime and these challenges that are posed by the new geopolitical context? So in my talk, I'm going to first illustrate this geopolitical competition that is evident in the politics of the international human rights regime by focusing on some debates within the Human Rights Council. I will then illustrate the challenges that the EU faces in achieving unity on some issues at the Human Rights Council and conclude with some thoughts about how the EU might situate itself to better promote and protect human rights, which is sort of the forward-looking approach that was just mentioned by Professor De Stefani. So first of all, the pushback on human rights at the UN Human Rights Council. Now, the international politics of human rights have always been contentious, dominated by great powers and concerns about protecting sovereignty from international oversight, coupled with only selective condemnations of human rights violations in other countries. But the breadth of the current backlash against existing human rights and against any extension of rights is striking. There is a consistent attempt by authoritarian and conservative states to redefine the human rights agenda to be, first of all, more respectful of sovereignty or domestic jurisdiction, and secondly, to be more respectful of different cultures, of so-called traditional values. Such states use international human rights institutions to try to legitimize such moves. The twist in this geopolitical culture war is that while Russia and China are now key centers of the anti-feminist, anti-gender movement, there are conservative right-wing parties and governments in democracies that subscribe to this views. So the backlash is both external to the West and internal inside the West. I don't think I need to say much more about that in the context of Italy. I'm now going to start hopefully sharing my screen. I trust that you all can see the picture of the hall in which the Human Rights Council meets in Geneva, with a rather spectacular ceiling of sort of stalactites and whatnot. Now, the Human Rights Council, which is pictured here, is the main UN governmental forum that is focused on human rights. It was created in 2006, replacing what was considered the so-called widely discredited and so-called highly politicized Commission on Human Rights. Criticism of the old commission came from developing countries, which complained that they were being singled out, they were being named and shamed unequally. And criticism came from Western countries, which complained that human rights violating states could easily get elected to the commission and therefore block scrutiny of their human rights records. The Human Rights Council is a slightly smaller body than the old 7 states elected from regional groups, but it is still possible for countries with truly awful human rights records to be elected to serve on it. For example, currently, China, Cuba, Eritrea, and Qatar are serving on the Human Rights Council. The Council also includes a new, what's called a universal periodic review, in which the human rights records of every UN state are reviewed. That's supposed to take the sting out of naming and shaming. But in its regular business, the Human Rights Council still considers the human rights records of specific countries, and this is still very controversial. Now, Russia was kicked off of the Human Rights Council in April 2022 by a vote of the UN General Assembly because of its invasion of Ukraine and the subsequent human rights violations, which the previous speaker has outlined quite extensively. Russia has often been a member, so it's in 2006, and it in fact has been leading the pushback on human rights on among other issues, so-called traditional values. The United States has been erratically engaged in the Human Rights Council. Under both George W. Bush and Donald Trump, the United States left the Human Rights Council as a member. It is now rejoined under Biden, but the US absence left a void, and China stepped in to assert its own interests, pushing back in terms of decrying those critiques of individual countries and on issues such as traditional values. The European Union itself is not a member of the Human Rights Council. It's not a state. But it's not even a so-called enhanced observer, which is a status which it has in the UN General Assembly. Instead, the EU leads in terms of trying to coordinate EU positions on to issue sort of common statements and to sponsor resolutions in the name of the European Union. But it's the Council presidency or another state that usually speaks on behalf of the EU in those proceedings. Only some EU member states are full members of the Human Rights Council at any given time, because there's only 47 states elected from the regional groups. Currently, the EU member states that are serving on the Human Rights Council are the Czech Republic, Czechia, which replaced Russia after it was kicked off, Finland, France, Germany, Lithuania, Luxembourg, Netherlands, and Poland. So therefore, it has 8 states. There are 8 states out of 47 that are EU member states. That's approximately 17% of the Human Rights Council. In the Human Rights Council, groups, what Katie Latikainen and I have argued are significant groups, play a very important role. The European Union is one very important group which speaks on behalf of its members, but so is the African Union, which speaks as the African group, and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. These are all groups that are very prominent in the diplomacy. In other words, statements and resolutions are made on behalf of those groups, and they amass votes in the Human Rights Council. National diplomats use these groups to try to exercise more influence. So in the context of the Human Rights Council, the EU may be very well organized and is usually tightly coordinated, but it is outnumbered, as it were, by larger groups such as the Africa Group. So in other words, exercising influence in the Human Rights Council is already a challenge for the European Union. China and the United States, however, have not usually worked within groups, but both Russia and China have been part of the so-called like-minded group, like-minded about things like traditional values and sovereignty. And China has associated itself with the G77, at least in the General Assembly. So therefore, the challenge for the European Union in this new geopolitics of human rights is posed not only by the increasing conflict between larger powers, namely China and the United States, but also by a context in which groups larger than it, or just as motivated as it, are active and often united. Now, although as I said at the beginning, human rights have long been subjected to geopolitical tensions, there has been increasing polarization at the Human Rights Council. And your HRC tracks key data on the Human Rights Council and found, for example, that in 2021, the highest number of resolutions and the largest percentage of adopted resolutions were voted on. That means that no consensus could be met within the Human Rights Council, and so therefore somebody, one state or another, called for a vote. That is a classic sign that there's a contestation because the states want to show that there's not unity on a particular topic. So that has been increasing. Furthermore, as they show in this sort of rather colorful table, this is a table about the evolution of amendments that have been made to council resolutions. And you can sort of look more carefully at the data if you want, but the key thing is that they're going up, right? In other words, 6 and so on through 2012, there were hardly any amendments that were made to resolutions, and now there are an increasing number of amendments made to resolutions. Another indication that states are sort of wanting to show that the text of the resolution as presented originally in the Human Rights Council isn't to their satisfaction, and therefore they are suggesting constant improvements. This has been particularly the case on resolutions on sexual orientation and gender identity, which I will come to in a second. Now, on resolutions within the Human Rights Council, China and Russia, when it was on the Human Rights Council, have consistently voted in exactly the opposite way to EU member states. Rarely do they vote together with the EU countries serving on the Human Rights Council. So this just, again, they're on opposite sides, very highly polarized. So we can see this geopolitical polarization across the board. But I just want to point out 2 areas where this is obvious and a sign of much more difficult debates to come. Firstly, in terms of debates on P5 members, that is members of the UN Security, the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, UK, France, China, Russia, and the United States. Now, usually those countries are able to deflect consideration of their human rights records. But very unusually, in 2022, this year, the Human Rights Council considered 2 resolutions on the human rights situation, one in China and one in Russia, and this is extremely rare. Now, in the 1990s, after the Tiananmen Square massacre, the EU had tried to raise the human rights record of China within the old Commission on Human Rights. They sponsored for a few years the name of the European Union. This was just following the Maastricht Treaty and the new Common Foreign and Security Policy. The European Union was much more active in international diplomacy. In the early 1990s, for several years in a row, the EU tried to sponsor a resolution on the human rights record of China. It was consistently not considered by the Commission on Human Rights. In other words, the EU was not successful in even having a debate on the issue. And in 1997, several countries, including France, Germany, Italy, and Spain, refused to support an EU resolution on China. You know, why should we continue to do this? China is also an important economic power. And so the EU agreed it would not continue to do this, but it would instead always vote against what's so-called no action motion on the resolution. In other words, it would always vote to have a resolution, which by then was sponsored by the United States, talked about within the Commission. But what was absent from the Human Rights Council, there was absolutely no question that there was going to be a resolution presented on China. So since the Human Rights Council was created in 2006, there's never been a proposal to even discuss the human rights record of China. In 2022, however, the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, OHCHR, and the High Commissioner at the time was Michelle Bachelet from Chile. It finally published an assessment of human rights concerns in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region of China. The assessment was initiated by her office because of allegations that it had been receiving about human rights violations of the Uyghurs. But Western countries had really been supporting and pushing for a report to be released. The release was eventually released on her last day, and so she would not have to deal. She could sort of do it and not have to deal with the pushback that she was going to face, which is an indication already of the pressure she was under from China and its allies. Now, so that happened in August. In September at the HRC, a group of states led by the United States decided to take matters further. So this again, they're going to push the issue in this intergovernmental forum. The group of states that decided to do this was comprised of the United States, Australia, Canada, the UK, Lithuania, and the 5 Nordic countries, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, and Sweden. Just hang on to the role of the Nordic countries until the end of my talk. They're important actors. That resolution called for a debate on the human rights situation in Xinjiang. But in 2022, China succeeded in defeating the resolution, including by lobbying heavily Muslim states, majority Muslim states such as Pakistan, Indonesia, to vote against it. You might have thought that Muslim states might have supported the resolution because of the Uyghur. The Uyghurs are Muslim majority. So the important thing here is, first of all, is that this attempt was defeated. But we should also look at sort of how the vote played out in terms of who abstained on this resolution. The Ukrainian abstention can be perhaps understood in that it did not want to anger China anymore because of the issues with its support for the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But other countries are a little surprising. And some of them, for example, Brazil and India, have been so-called strategic partners of the European Union. So in other words, and democracies, and yet they abstained on this particular vote. So just an indication of the polarization. So that was one resolution that happened in 2022, in September 2022, October 2022 in the Human Rights Council on a P5 member state. The second resolution, which was debated the day after this particular one on the Uyghurs, was on Russia. Now, as far as I know, and I've been following the Commission on Human Rights and Human Rights Council for quite a long time, there has never been an attempt to have a serious debate about the human rights record of Russia within this intergovernmental forum of the United Nations. But in this Council, 26 of the 27 EU member states tabled a resolution to appoint a special rapporteur on the human rights situation in Russia. And this was successful for the first time. So in other words, this is, as far as I can tell, I think I would need confirmation from other people, but I believe that this is the very first time that there has been a human rights resolution on a P5 member in the Commission on Human Rights for the Human Rights Council. And here, the almost EU, but not quite EU, because it was only 26 of the 27 member states that sponsored this resolution, they were successful. But here again, you can see that there were a large number of abstentions, including the usual democracies that are also supposedly strategic partners in Brazil, India, and Mexico. So in other words, this polarization is affecting relations also with these abstainers. They don't want to be drawn into these geopolitical tensions regarding the human rights records of a P5 member. Now, I do want to point out that China repeatedly does, in fact, issue statements attacking the human rights records of the United States, UK, Canada, and the European Union. So in response to the draft resolution on the Uyghurs, for example, it argued that the US and some other countries disregard their own serious human rights violations, indulge in finger pointing, and so on. The China, I have to say, just like every other state, also points fingers of its own, for example, pointing out to racism within and other Western countries. And this is a bit of a deja vu from the Cold War period, I have to say. Now, so first of all, the first thing I wanted to say was that these debates about the human rights situations in P5 members is just one clear indication of the extent of geopolitical tension and polarization in the international human rights regime. Another indication of how geopolitical tensions are affecting international human rights can be seen in the pushback on gender equality. And this is having a clear negative impact on the development of human rights in this area. China and Russia are part of what scholars have identified as sustained efforts by conservative states, as well as non-state actors, to criticize, limit, and roll back women's rights principles found in UN treaties, declarations, and international policies. And UN bodies, such as the Human Rights Council, are now a battleground LGBTQI rights. Now, these battles tend to focus on the language used in resolutions, declarations, treaties, and so on. The aims of these states are to so-called protect the family and traditional values. A family is designed basically as mommy, daddy, and 2 kids with the white picket fence. It does not include gay couples or single parents, for example. They also object to terms such as reproductive rights, sexual and reproductive health, sexual orientation and gender identity, and gender itself, the word gender itself. Instead, they continually insist that only biological sex can be mentioned and the family and traditional values must be respected. Now, this battle has been seen at the Human Rights Council, particularly in efforts to support an independent expert into violence based on sexual orientation and gender identity. And I'm just going to show you the most recent voting record on this mandate. Now, the mandate was approved. In other words, there were enough states, because this is a combination of sort of European states as well as American states, both North and South American states, in favor of the mandate of this independent expert on violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. But again, you can see that in the against category are countries such as China, as well as other very conservative countries. In the abstention, I just want to note Poland. I'm going to come back to this in just a minute. So to sum up this first section, we can see intense polarization within the Human Rights Council, which is affecting the development and protection even of existing rights. Just for the European Union, this is the second part of my talk. Now, the European Union is in and of itself is quite active at the Human Rights Council. It had a period in which it was less active. It is now much more active than it had been in terms of putting forward resolutions. I mean, I've done a lot of work on this. There was a period of time in which the European Union was having particularly in the Commission on Human Rights, was having so little success with country resolutions that they simply decided not to try to do much of that. And so there was a sort of a limiting of European Union action. But in the last 3-4 years in particular, they've been much more active. The kinds of topics that are the subject of resolutions in the Human Rights Council include Afghanistan, Belarus, Eritrea, Myanmar, North Korea, freedom of religion and belief, the rights of the child, and more recently, climate change as well. What I'm talking about here are specifically resolutions that are made in the name of the European Union, not in the name of EU member states. I would just add there's very little coordination on those kinds of resolutions at the EU level. So the EU does try to be an active player in the Human Rights Council. It is a self-proclaimed champion of international human rights, but it's got to figure out how to respond to this new, much more tense international politics of human rights. There is still a lingering attachment to engagement. That means sort of basically I'm going to cynical views, closing your eyes to human rights violations because the material benefits that come from engagement are too strong, such as dependence on gas and oil imports. So there is this sort of lingering attachment to engagement, but there's also this kind of problem with pushing back countries such as China or Russia because it is such a tense atmosphere. Now, the external atmosphere is geopolitically wrought, but the biggest problem for the European Union is that the backlash is also internal. So reaching consensus on human rights issues has become almost impossible within the European Union. Now, the EU member states that are on the Human Rights Council at any one given time can they do sometimes not vote the same way. What I call split votes, so that there are some EU member states that say yes, some that abstain, or vote against. Do happen. They mostly happen on issues regarding human rights in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, but they can also happen on resolutions on racism or inequality. And it hasn't always been the usual suspects that I'm going to talk about in a second that vote differently to the majority. Right? In other words, there's a sort of an equal distribution of difficult member states in terms of EU unity. However, Hungary and Poland do pose particular challenges to the European Union, most notably on gender equality issues, which, like I said, is a lightning rod for dissent right now in the Human Rights Council. Now, states have staked out a quite progressive position on gender equality and sexual orientation, but there are increasingly evident divisions within Europe over these issues. And Hungary and Poland, for example, have been resisting the use of the term gender equality in EU documents. And these internal splits have spilled over into the external human rights diplomacy that the European Union tries to engage in at the Human Rights Council. So, for example, I already showed you that voting record on just the most recent resolution in the Human Rights Council on the mandate of the independent expert on SOGI, on sexual orientation and gender identity, in which Poland abstained. In 2019, that resolution was also debated, and the EU was still visibly divided. Only 25 EU member states decided to co-sponsor the resolution. Hungary and Poland refused to do so. Excuse me, let me try to get to the next slide. Hungary, this is the vote back in 2019 on that, one of those earlier iterations of this resolution, and Hungary abstained, so splitting the European vote. When Hungary did abstain, its representative in the HRC declared that it was doing so because it reserves the sovereign right to define the personal scope and the content of family relations and of marriage in accordance with its national legislation. In other words, quite a traditional values kind of stance. So there's splits. The geopolitical tensions are magnified in a way by the fact that the EU is also experiencing its own issues in terms of unity. Now, as a result, the nature of debates on sexual orientation and gender identity in particular, but not only, the Nordic countries in particular have acted together, separate from the European Union, to put forward a more progressive position at the HRC, the Human Rights Council. Indeed, Nordic collaboration within the human rights regime complex has become increasingly important, and in the last 2 to 3 years in Geneva, they have been acting together with the 3 Baltic countries. And I'm just going to, the next slide that I show you then indicates statements that are by Nordic. The blue line is statements by Nordic countries. The orange line are statements by the Nordic group plus the Baltic 3. So they call themselves sometimes the NB8, the Nordic Baltic 8 countries. That their activity has exploded at the Human Rights Council. They do not coordinate with the European Union. I've interviewed several of the diplomats who have said they see no reason to let the EU know what they are doing. And they are not even trying to lead the European Union, as they say they have given up on trying to lead the European Union on human rights issues. So the EU splits are leading to a much more, it's not serious, but it's certainly much more evident division between EU member states, in which some have decided that they simply need to speak out, and to speak out much more actively on behalf of much more progressive human rights positions. Initially, the Nordic Baltic countries were speaking out primarily on issues relating to sexual orientation and gender identity, women's rights, and so on. Now they speak out on almost every. They present a slightly different, more progressive view than the European Union. Now the EU divisions, I'm going to stop, I can stop sharing if I can figure out how to do that. Yes, stop sharing right now. Those EU divisions are not only over gender policy. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has led to much EU unity. I mean, we've seen successive sanctions packages, but there are cracks. And we know about the cracks, particularly with Hungary. Hungary has often hedged its support for the EU position. And although it has never voted against or abstained on EU-backed resolutions on Russia in the UN, either at the Human Rights Council or in New York, but that resolution on Russia that was successful at the Human Rights Council was sponsored by 26 of the 27 states and not Hungary. So in other words, Hungary refused to join in the EU consensus on Russian human rights. So to sum up this particular main section of my talk, the EU is divided on culture war issues and other issues, from Russia to the situation between Israel and Palestine. And this is prompting some states to act increasingly separately to make it clear that they have different positions. So just finally, briefly, what can the EU do about this particular situation, both the difficult internal situation and this incredibly tense geopolitical situation that has spilled over into international politics of human rights? Well, about the internal situation, that's extremely difficult for them to try to solve. What they can do, I think, is continue to work with other regions on issues where common views can be built. So, for example, for 2 decades or more, the EU has been working together with the Latin American group on the rights of the child, right? Reaching out across groups to try to build this consensus on rights of the child. They reached out to the Organization of Islamic Cooperation to try to coordinate views in terms of resolutions on the situation of the Rohingya minority in Myanmar. So I think there's much more work that could be done to try to build those kind of cross-regional coalitions on some issues, to try to break up groups, in other words, so that they're not faced with a sort of monolithic conservative coalition against them. I think it would also be helpful if in relation to some of the complaints that are the so-called finger pointing that goes against European states, they could admit European Union member states could be much more candid about problems that are there. And they could engage constructively with images from of importance to the global south. And I will just end right there. Thank you very much for your cooperation.
Thank you. Thank you a lot, Professor Smith. So apparently you gave us plastic evidence per tabulas of how the geopolitical situation is affecting the EU, not only in its foreign policy, let's say external policy, but also internally. I forgot to say at the beginning that, of course, we hope to have some interactions with the audience, including those who are online. At the end of the three presentations, we will open the floor to any questions or requests for clarifications, comments, and so on coming from the audience, of course. And now the third speaker of this morning. We remain in the in room 20, let's say, in the Human Rights Council, because Professor Jan Frey has been appointed recently as the first special rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights in the context of climate change. So Professor Jan Frey is an international environmental law and policy expert. He has primarily focused on mitigation policies and loss and damage policies associated with the Paris Agreement, the Kyoto Protocol, and related instruments. Jan Frey worked for the Tuvalu government for over 21 years and was appointed as Tuvalu's ambassador for climate change and environment between 2015 and 19. He teaches international environmental policy and environmental law at the Fenner School of Environment and Society of the Australian National University. I'm particularly pleased to give the floor to Jan Frey, because I mean, it was high time for the Human Rights Council to get deeply involved in this issue of human rights and climate change, and is now, let's say, the ambassador of this important topic worldwide. So thank you for coming, Jan, and you have the floor.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'd like to thank the organizers for allowing me to speak. And this is not an academic paper. I have to admit, I don't get a chance to write academic papers anymore as special rapporteur. It's just a sort of a expression of the sort of social, political, and geographical landscape of the work I'm doing in the context of climate change, and looking at that in the context of armed conflict. So the Human Rights Council has stated that climate change constitutes one of the most pressing and serious threats to the ability of present and future generations to enjoy the right to life. Since 2008, the Human Rights Council has repeatedly adopted resolutions expressing concern that climate change poses an immediate and far-reaching threat to people and communities around the world, with implications for the full enjoyment of human rights, particularly those of most vulnerable people. And interestingly enough, the sort of major sponsors of this group, of these resolutions, has come primarily from Bangladesh, Philippines, and Vietnam as the major sponsors of this resolution. So the links between climate change and armed conflict, are there. Sometimes it's contested, but there's certainly growing evidence that there is clear links between climate change and armed conflict. Out of the 20 countries considered the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, 13 are also affected by an armed conflict. Conflicts harm assets required to facilitate and the absorption of shocks and adaptations, such as institutions, markets, and livelihoods. People are impacted by food insecurity, rising food prices, and income losses. The Notre Dame Global Adaptation Index states that among the countries ranked as the most vulnerable to climate change, Afghanistan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Mali, Somalia, and Yemen are in the states of violence and protracted conflicts. And it's not hard to see that these countries are also seriously affected by climate change. The United Nations Refugee Agency estimates that a global forced displacement has surpassed 84 million at mid-2021. So this is where we're seeing this link. the issue of climate change displacement, people moved away from their homes as a consequence of climate change related events. These might be sudden onset events where people are moved temporarily, or they may be moved permanently through longer term events such as droughts. As the end of 2020, 49 million people are internally displaced. An estimated 35 million of the 82.4 million forcibly displaced people are children below the 18 years of age. So there's a particular demographic here and concern about the issue of the rights of the child as well as a consequence of this displacement. And it's been estimated by a recent report by the World Bank that over 216 million people could move within their countries by 2050 across 6 regions, according to this report. So this is an increasing concern about the displacement of people as a consequence of climate change. And one particular region that is of most concern is around the Lake Chad region of West Africa. Climate change has had a significant impact on the livelihoods of lake residents and causing human displacement long before the current crisis that has occurred there and conflict. Boko Haram has exploited these impacts to advance its agenda by exploiting the effects of climate change to seize more land and capitalizing on socioeconomic marginalization. The armed group has taken advantage of historical underdevelopment of the region to maintain de facto control. So this group is obviously, using these circumstances to take advantage of the situation. In Nigeria, since the beginning of the Nigeria's conflict with Islamist group Boko Haram, again in 2009, more than 2 million people have been displaced in the country's northeast. And as we've seen just in recent times, we're seeing a trend here where countries suffer prolonged droughts and then sudden floods. And this is an increasing sort of phenomenon linked to climate change events. In the Borno state's government has moved to shut down the camps. So these are people in camps as a consequence of being displaced. And since 2013, at least 4,000 children have been detained in Nigeria. Many were abducted against their will or apprehended when fleeing Boko Haram attacks. Some were only 5 years old. So this is an interesting circumstance where the Nigerian government has held these children under suspicion of being connected to Boko Haram. So these are the sort of challenges that are faced by children in these circumstances, being brought into, enforced militias, but not all of them are in that circumstances. So these are the sort of challenges that are faced in these circumstances. In Pakistan, we see that the US National Intelligence estimate, a study from the US Office of the Director of National Intelligence, issued a report that highlighted climate change's security challenges around the globe. So this is a sort of assessment by the US Office of Director of National Intelligence, and they indicated Pakistan, a nuclear nation, was identified as one of the 11 highly vulnerable countries of concern. And the NIE identified flooding as a security risk in Pakistan. And this report came true in the very serious floods that occurred in Pakistan. So, Pakistan is still trying to recover from these droughts the floods. And these are the sort of concerns around security and issues. And Syria, there is a view that the war in Syria was driven or partially driven by a 9-year drought by climate change. Agricultural areas of the country displaced millions of farmers who were subsequently recruited into the Assad opposition. This view is contested, but there certainly is a perspective, and undoubtedly there are some linkages to this 9-year drought. Libya is another circumstance where we're seeing a lot of migrants being displaced from various countries from Africa, but interestingly enough, not just, but outside Africa as well. And I identify Bangladesh as part of that. I recently visited Bangladesh and saw the sort of impacts of climate change there. It's estimated that between 300 to 400,000 people are internally displaced each year as a consequence of climate change events in Bangladesh. So this is, migrants are moving to Libya due to extreme poverty, violence, persecution, family separation, gender inequality, and a lack of access to health, education, decent work, food and water, and the adverse effects of climate change and environmental degradation as a lack of fulfillment of the right to development. So here we're seeing a sort of multitude of factors driving people to migrate to Libya as a way of moving across to Europe. According to the International Organization of Migration figures, the top 10 countries of origin for migrants repatriated from Libya through their program are Nigeria, Mali, Niger, Bangladesh, Guinea, Sudan, the Gambia, Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, and Senegal. Each one of those countries are suffering climate change impacts, though there are other, contributing factors around this. So there clearly are some strong connections between this sort of whole issue of displacement and climate change. And of course, in Libya, this is, as a result of a recent report by the Office of the High Commission for Human Rights, looking at a report on assisted return and reintegration. These people who have moved and migrated in this area are migrants being systematically and routinely subjected to criminalization, marginalization, racism, and xenophobia, and face a wide range of human rights violations and abuses by state and non-state actors, including unlawful killings and forced disappearance, slavery, and forced labor, arbitrary detention, torture, illegal trafficking, sexual violence, and extortion. So these are serious problems. And this is one of the issues that I'm looking at. As part of my mandate, it's a 3-year mandate, and there are a number of issues that I've identified that I want to look at. And climate change displacement is one of those, and I'll be reporting to the Human Rights Council next year on this issue. And one of the particular issues that I'm looking at is people who are displaced across international borders, so-called climate change refugees. But of course, there is no definition for a climate refugee. The UN Convention on Refugees does not give a classification of a climate change refugee. So these people, in effect, fall through the cracks as far as proper legal protection is concerned. And so I'm looking at what sort of legal options could be possible to give particular attention and protection to people displaced across international borders as a consequence of climate change. Of course, it won't be easy because of these various contributing factors that exacerbate, how do you define somebody who's displaced by climate change and not some other factor? But nevertheless, I think there's growing evidence to be able to identify people as climate change displaced people. And I certainly want to explore legal options for protection of those people. And in Honduras, migration, and we're seeing this as sort of a migration of people through what's called the dry corridor and its neighboring northern triangle countries, El Salvador and Guatemala, has climbed in recent years. Of course, the reasons for this major migration heading north to the United States is complex. They're including poverty, unemployment, and violence. But the increase in migration also coincides with a drought, which began in 2014. And again, subsequently, we've seen heavy rains and landslides, people dying as a consequence of these events. And I'll be visiting Honduras next year. I met with the government, was in Sharm el-Sheikh last week at the climate change COP to seek their support for me to attend a country visit in Honduras next year to have a look directly at the situation there. So you can just see the enormity of these issues of people being displaced and the human rights implications of those. So people who suffer from the impacts of climate change are hence forced to be displaced, lose a number of their basic rights, including the right to food, water, sanitation, health, shelter, education, and for some, the right to life. And these are just some of the basic human rights as a consequence of being displaced. And women have particular human rights issues. After severe weather events or extreme droughts, women may be forced to walk long distances to collect water. In these circumstances, they are subject to harassment and sexual violence and trafficking. And children and persons with disabilities are also significantly disadvantaged. And in my visit to Bangladesh, I was able to meet with women's groups who are in those situations explicitly. And what we're seeing particularly is, families moving from rural areas because of the impacts of climate change into informal settlements in Dhaka, and women in particular subject to these circumstances of sexual violence and trafficking in these informal settlements because of lack of enforcement. And also children and persons with disabilities are advantaged. The children moving to these informal settlements lose their right to education and put into child labour situations, or again trafficked or sold. And also people with disabilities. The Bangladesh government, for instance, has produced a number of shelters to deal with hurricane protection, but a lot of these shelters are not designed for disabled people. So they're left behind to face the consequences of these hurricanes. There's some other interesting sort of consequences that are around the world, and in my part of the world, this is quite a significant issue, is that we're seeing conflict over declining fisheries. And so climate change has effect on fisheries for a number of reasons. The warming of the ocean forces fish away from some areas. There's lack of oxygen, lack of food supply, and this is causing a decline in fish stocks. Ocean acidification is also affecting coral reefs, the young breeding of major fish stocks like tuna, and other consequences. And so we're seeing an increased militarization of the Pacific region, partially, through the sort of various political vacuums, but also around this sort of protection of rights to fish in the region. And this will be an increasing tension. And I have written a paper for the Toda Institute around this, trying to look at what are the necessary processes of primary security threats to the Pacific due to climate change, and looking particularly at this sort of militarization of protection of fisheries in the region and the consequences around that, and trying to find a regional approach to dealing with some of those issues to de-escalate this sort of increased militarization of the Pacific region. There are some other interesting challenges that connect with climate change. So actions to address climate change, activities that are concerned are also causing tensions and armed conflict. So the issue around cobalt mines, lithium mines are part of this, for the new e-technologies, e-vehicles, protection of those. And what we're seeing is, private security agencies being employed, to defend these mines against actions of workers whose, lives and work are seriously affected by the extreme conditions in these mines. So this is a serious issue. And of course, the US, has strategic interests in these sort of so-called green technologies, and, as using their sort of a force to sort of deal with that. So this is a statement made by the Department of Defense, US Department of Defense currently dominates lithium-ion battery sector. And that's a problem since military capabilities depend on batteries. The Navy alone has 2,000 to 3,000 systems that rely on lithium-ion batteries, and future capacities for unmanned systems, directed energy weapons, all rely on lithium-ion. So we're now seeing, increased tensions around acquisition of some of these strategic minerals and consequences of human rights implications of these. When I was in Sharm el-Sheikh last week, I met with an indigenous woman from the northern part of Argentina, where there's a lithium mine there. And she was saying, that the indigenous people have not been given prior informed consent around this mine, and it's affecting their livelihoods quite seriously. There are other issues around sort of impacts of climate change on military assets and former military resources, and there's certainly the various military assets around the world are impacted by climate change, and particularly former ones in my part of the world. This Runit dome in the Marshall Islands was a dome built to sort of collect the nuclear waste from US testing of nuclear weapons in the Marshall Islands, and placed and then covered with this concrete dome. This dome is now cracking, and there are concerns rise will release contaminated material from this dome. So there are all sorts of issues around climate change, the connection to these sorts of assets and the impacts of climate change. I gave a training program for young climate change youth negotiators in Cairo the week before last in preparation for the COP. And one of the women there was from the Marshall Islands, and she had this, very typical scar on her neck, which is, I didn't inquire about it, but I've seen so many Marshallese with this scar, and it's basically their thyroids are removed because of nuclear contamination. So there's this, and she told me she had to, have regular medical treatment. But this is, the ongoing legacy of nuclear testing. There are some complexities around this, and the around sort of linking climate change and security issues. For a number of years, Pacific Island countries were pushing very hard for climate change to be considered in the Security Council. But there was pushback from the Caribbean countries because they were concerned that P5 countries in particular would push back on this issue. I think Germany sponsored some resolutions under the Security Council when they were a non-permanent representative. And so that there are tensions around the securitization of actions on climate change. And we've seen this with the Homeland Security listed 5 members of Climate Direct Action as extremists alongside mass killers. So, people taking action, environmental defenders taking action, are now being securitized, and, security forces being used against them. And as we've seen in these defenders in Brazil who were killed by allegedly by private security companies protecting mines in Brazil, that these are still cases to be heard. So there is some work, particularly at the UN level to sort of de-escalate some of these tensions around climate change and internal conflicts, particularly at the sort of very local level, particularly in West Africa. So this, Department of Policy Making, the UN Department of Policy Making, have developed a sort of toolkit for engaging options for UN mediators to sort of discuss through issues. And so this seems to be very useful at a very local level. United Nations Environment Programme has been working with communities in northern Darfur and in Sudan and the Karnali River Basin in Nepal to pilot test integrated climate change and peace building approaches. So to give, create the sort of protections necessary for people against the impacts of climate change as a way of de-escalating tensions around that. But these are only very sort of piecemeal. And of course, major action to address climate change, mitigation action to address climate change is really the only way to deal with this issue. And so just to get to my work, this is the sort of partially the mandate that created my position as special rapporteur to study and identify how the adverse effects of climate change, including sudden, slow onset disasters, affect the full and effective enjoyment of human rights, and make recommendations on how to address and prevent these effects, and particular ways to strengthen the integration of human rights concerns into policy-making, legislation, plans addressing climate change. No small task, I should add, to have to deal with this issue, and it's certainly been a challenge since taking on this position. And the expectations are quite high. In my recent meeting in Sharm el-Sheikh, I met with, participated in discussions with people with disabilities, Indigenous peoples, children's groups, youth groups, civil society organizations generally, and environmental defenders in Egypt as well. And I met with the sister of Fatah, who's currently in jail on a hunger strike. So these are the sort of challenges that is part of my position. And so I recently presented a report to the UN to the UN General Assembly just 3 weeks ago, and I made a number of recommendations on this, and I can share you the link to that report if people are interested. It's certainly the intersection between climate change, human rights, and security issues is very real and a growing concern, as we're seeing with a growing number of people displaced as a consequence of climate change. Climate change displacement is at least a threat multiplier to armed conflict and is likely to escalate, and caution needs to be applied to security-based approach to climate change due to concerns about human rights. Measures. So some of the recommendations I made at the UN General Assembly: to commence negotiations of a legally binding instrument that gives appropriate protection to people displaced across international borders as a consequence of climate change. And anybody who's interested in that, I'd be very happy to have discussions around that issue. And to agree to an international fund for loss and damage. This is one of the most critical issues at the COP, and was sabotaged even before the COP started. There was an agenda fight on Saturday night that went all night before the COP started over whether or not there would be an agenda item on a loss and damage fund, primarily instigated by the United States, who had this obsession about the issue and wanted a footnote in the decision on the agenda on liability and compensation. And the issue is about compensation. We have to deal with the costs of the impacts of climate change. If you think about Pakistan, Nigeria, and Somalia at the moment, the huge costs of those countries is enormous and is beyond the scale of what climate change convention can deal with. And so one of the recommendations I made was that the UN Secretary General establish a group of financial experts to think outside the box and explore new options for financing loss and damage, because we're talking about billions of dollars. We only have to think about the costs to Pakistan in the billions of dollars. We've got to find some way of helping those countries rebuild. And whether you call it compensation, rehabilitation, or whatever, it's necessary. And I met with the UN Secretary General's Special Advisor on climate change at Sharm, and he said this, the UN Secretary General is thinking about this issue, but needs some pressure from organisations, either civil society organisations or governments, to encourage him to set up this group of finance experts. So if you feel like writing a letter to the Secretary General, please do so. So thank you very much, and very much appreciate coming to this meeting. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And now we have more or less half an hour at our disposal for taking questions or comments from the audience addressed to the three speakers of this morning. So it's always difficult to find someone who wants to start, but maybe either in the room here or online, someone wants to start. Take it easy, it's not. Sure. It's definitely, there's a lot of things to digest. I also consider that in this afternoon we will meet with, in the panels, so there will be, more occasions to address some of the issues that were mentioned in the speeches of this morning and discuss them with some other researchers and so on. But this is an opportunity with the speakers we have, Karen Smith, Wolfgang Benedek, and Jan Fry. Yes. I think there is, and a microphone.
I have a question for Dr. Fry. Since you are just back from COP, I was wondering actually if you notice any reference to the issue of the war in Ukraine in the discussion among representatives. That's a very easy one, just to, guys, thank you, Corey.
Good morning, and thank you to all the speakers for the presentations. For the Special Rapporteur, I'm a co-editor of a journal that's about to have a special issue on climate change litigation in the Global South. And I just wondered if you could comment on what you see as the prospects of using strategic litigation to contribute to mitigating climate change effects.
I have a question for Dr. Fry as well. I'm wondering about climate refugees and how close the UN is to establishing a definition that's recognized internationally.
Okay, maybe we can stop here and give the floor to Jan Fry.
Well, thank you very much. Is there one online? Okay, well, let me go to the first one. It's a funny thing attending a COP as a special rapporteur. For many years, I attended the COP as a negotiator for Tuvalu, and it's like a parallel universe. You've got the sort of the government people negotiating words and agreements and text of decisions, and then you've got this other parallel universe of side events. Where people give talks. And this is one of the issues I'm trying to deal with, is how do we connect these two parallel universes? And so for the first time, I was feeling very guilty that I really didn't know what was going on in the negotiations itself. Only a small bit of feedback from our civil society organizations. So in the discussions that I was involved with, I didn't hear any discussions about the war in Ukraine. So I guess that's an interesting issue, whether there is a connection to climate change around that. Certainly, to sort of look at it more broadly, as Karen indicated, there are particularly, there were people from the Office of the High Commission for Human Rights there as well. we were, trying to lobby to get human rights language into some of the decisions at the COP, and we're getting pushback from countries very similar to what Karen mentioned about some of the countries in the Human Rights Council. And I spoke, having worked with least developed countries, I spoke to one colleague about that, why she was opposed to human rights language, particularly on action for climate and education, which seems to be a pretty innocuous sort of a work program to develop. And she was concerned about the issue of sexual orientation and whether this was a sort of opening the door for gay rights, basically, in climate change negotiations. So I tried to convince her this was a sort of broader issue, looking at the impacts of climate change on people generally. I'm not sure whether I was successful or not in trying to, move her position. The issue of climate change litigation is actually one of my thematic issues that I'm dealing with as part of my mandate, and I'll be reporting to the UN General Assembly next year on that issue. And so I've just employed a consultant to have a look at those issues. She's a lawyer from Brazil, and there are particular issues that I want to look at as far as climate change litigation, where there are gaps. And, when I spoke with children and youth groups, there are certainly issues around standing provisions. Some youth groups have been denied access to courts, and I'm trying to look at those issues. And I think there's a sort of growing interest from the global south around litigation. But there are equally challenges, taking litigation has a cost factor. And again, this is one of the limitations that were, addressed to me. And how we can get around that sort of cost factor. There are lots of lawyers groups who provide pro bono support, but nevertheless, there are still cost factors that countries have to deal with. So these are the issues. And finally, with the issue of climate change refugees and the definition, I think the Convention on Refugees is, just the impression I'm getting is that they would not want to open up the definition. Considering the history of the UN Convention on Refugees, they would not like to open up the definition to include climate change refugees. And I'm looking at various options. There could be an optional protocol to that convention, but again, I suspect there will be pushback from that we may have to find a new legal instrument to define climate change refugees. And that's, the critical issue is where's the best legal forum to create that right and protections, to climate change refugees, as they're called. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm monitoring the people online. So if you have questions to ask, just raise your virtual hand or just start speaking. Okay, we have time for another round. Okay, Pietro, you're monopolizing the discussion.
Good.
We give also time for people to digest.
Other guests, yeah, I have the time. I have a question for Professor Karen Smith about the EU. What does this division on key human rights issues mean in terms of the credibility of the European Union as an I don't know if actually Professor Smith is still online. She's I can. Yes. Okay. So it means in terms of credibility of the EU as an international actor, because for long the EU has been, shaping its international agency on this type of values. But of course, if you start lagging also in terms of agreement on that, what does it mean in terms of its credibility? That's the question. Thank you.
And maybe if I can join Pietro with another question for Professor Smith, and then there is another question there. My question would be about So you spoke about the difficulties that is now surrounding this idea of, let's say, human rights diplomacy. There was a book actually published in the framework of the Global Campus of Human Rights some years ago, maybe already 10 years ago, that was, try to explore what can be the role of, for example, special rapporteurs or even the High Commissioner for Human Rights as ambassadors of human rights in the world, as, let's say, actors of human rights diplomacy. So whether in your studies you have noticed any special impact that these figures, the High Commissioner, for example, special rapporteurs, special advisor of the Security Secretary General and so on, so the role that they may have in influencing, decision of states, decision within international organizations and so on. So whether you haven't never impacted this kind of, bumped into this kind of dynamics. Thank you. And then a question over there.
I have 3 questions, and apologies, it might take a while. So let me start with the first to Dr. Fry. You sound slightly isolated in your role, championing human rights on this topic. Are there any positive encounters you have, any ways forward you can see? To Karen Smith, my question is whether you've done any comparative studies and whether you have a comparative, for instance, on how the Council is responding now as against, say, post 9/11. And then my question to Wolfgang and perhaps Paolo and the organizers as well. And I'm going to try to be succinct here. I'm Sri Lankan in origin, so I've grown up in a war. And I find it quite difficult to understand how the consequences of war are outlined in places and rooms like this. I find this all the time in my research as well, where there's this big gap, a bit like Dr. Fry said, the events on the side and the governments that are talking inside. And I just want to find out whether you have strategies and thoughts of how we can move forward beyond consultations. I understand that a lot of this work is informed and developed through victim consultations. But for instance, from the area I work in, transitional justice, it's now very clear that a lot of the mechanisms and the policies we've come up with are not succeeding because the very people who are affected by conflict are not participating in drawing these plans out. And so I just want to get your views on how far we are moving beyond this, even in terms of this entire conference, beyond consultancy, beyond consultations, beyond research. What do we have to make sure that when we analyze the consequences of war, it reflects what those who are affected by war feel and think? Thank you.
Thank you. So we can maybe start from you.
Well, thank you. Of course, this position is quite challenging because it's so broad in scope, but there is, some positive, clearly positive elements to it. Excuse me. When I gave my first report to the Human Rights Council in June this year, there were 84 countries who spoke. And this I think, is a record in the Human Rights Council from responding to a special rapporteur. And so there was broad interest in this issue, and particularly, from vulnerable countries to do that. And I think the fact that countries like Vietnam, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Philippines are sort of strong supporters of this, and some island countries, Fiji, Marshall Islands, became co-sponsors of my mandate, clearly indicate that there is a strong support for this issue, but there's still issues around connecting climate change and human rights, and that's certainly what I'm hoping to do. There is quite a strong, constituency of civil society organizations who have that. And I've had numerous meetings when I was in Egypt, but online meetings with various civil society groups, faith-based organizations who are strongly supportive of it, Indigenous peoples organizations, peoples with disabilities. And there's a whole working group on climate change and human rights, which is a sort of collective group of civil society organizations that connect and meet regularly and communicate with me regularly. So there are, clearly I'm not alone in this task, and I'm getting lots of support, particularly from civil society organizations. Thank you.
Thank you. I will give the floor to Karen Smith.
Great, thank you. Thank you for the questions. I mean, I'll take the first question about special rapporteurs and independent experts and whatnot. And I'll just say that no, that hasn't been the focus of my research. So I'm afraid I can't really comment on what sort of impact they have. But I do know that there can be quite a few intense discussions over the appointment of those particular people, and then the kinds of shall we say, careful, tactful diplomacy that they have to engage in when they are presenting reports on particularly controversial aspects, and sometimes there can be quite vicious attacks on some of those people. I'm thinking particularly about the independent expert on sexual orientation and gender identity. But I have not looked at their role particularly. I have focused on the role of the Europeans basically on them and the European Union. I'll then do comparative studies, and I'll come back to the credibility of the EU. I mean, so the Human Rights Council was created in 2006 after the big kind of UN summit, which Kofi Annan led, and that was supposed to discuss reform of the entire UN system, but wasn't able to, for example, touch on Security Council reform, but was also in the same reform moment that the Human Rights Council was created. The responsibility to protect was also agreed, at least rhetorically, at the UN. That moment of reform came about because of the invasion of, well, particularly because of the invasion of Iraq, which of course the Bush administration had, in the United States, had linked to the 9/11 attacks. So because of the fact that they basically, the UN, Tony Blair from the United Kingdom tried to get the Bush administration to go to the UN. I mean, I don't want to go back over all of that history, but multilateralism kind of was seriously under pressure from the Bush administration in the early 2000s, and that is partly related to 9/11, but not entirely. Mostly, I think, to the invasion of Iraq. Now, what happened then was that the Bush administration, famously, of course, John Bolton from in that administration, it's basically said you could remove the top, I think, 10 floors of the Secretary General's, or the Secretariat in New York, just smash it to pieces and nobody would notice, which of course includes the office of the Secretary General at the UN. I mean, effectively saying we don't need to pay attention to the United Nations. We're not engaging with this kind of, airless, banal kind of diplomacy at all. So a full-fronted attack on multilateralism came from the Bush administration. Well, what we thought was a full-fronted attack on multilateralism. Then, when we got to the Trump administration, we realized Bush was truly light in terms of the attack on multilateralism. But in that context, then at the commission, because the Commission on Human Rights was there for the immediate post 9/11 period, and then was replaced by the Human Rights Council. The 9/11 attacks themselves, of course, generated considerable sympathy and empathy around the world. So there was a brief moment of unity, which then collapsed with the invasion of Iraq. But in terms of what I've noticed, in particular, the Human Rights Council, is that what many countries focused on in the human rights context was Islamophobia. and in particular deformation of religions, which became quite a difficult issue for the West and the Europeans, and because the United States had absented itself from the Human Rights Council. So for the EU to try to handle, it's because it touched on issues of free speech as well as freedom of religion. That issue has now been more or less neutralized as a kind of lightning rod for dissent, and the EU does deserve some credit for managing to negotiate through and put together a consensual, more or less consensual resolution on the freedom of religion or belief, which touched on some of the issues about that some countries were concerned about in terms of anti-Islamic discrimination. But I think it's not just 9/11. I think human rights have always been contentious. I think this idea that human rights are somehow apolitical, I think is simply wrong. It's very erroneous historically. You have to fight for human rights, and there is always a fight over particular human rights. This has always been the case, right? Women's rights did not come about because they were handed down from some sort of thing up high. They had to be fought for. And that is a political process. So human rights are, by their very nature, I think, political, and they always are negotiated. Every treaty has been negotiated, which means that there are compromises made and there are fights and so on. So human rights are political, and they always have been. What I think is more, so the geopolitical tensions have always been there. I think there was a kind of a honeymoon period at the end of the Cold War, when supposedly we were all becoming democracies, et cetera, is the end of history. And then I think by the early 2000s, that became much more difficult. And I think now what we have seen is this consistent pushback on kind of supposedly settled questions. So I think that's the big difference now. The other, I think, big difference, well, the other change, I think, is this willingness now to confront the P5. So you're bringing in the kind of power struggles. Well, you're bringing in, I don't want to necessarily use the language, but let's call it a kind of new Cold War-like atmosphere into the discussion of human rights, and that's never been good for human rights. We can go over the 40 years of the Cold War and what it did to human rights, but it's not particularly promising in terms of trying to develop or even strengthen the regime as it is. So I do think that now we are seeing quite a difference, that we're coming down from the high of the unipolar moment of the 90s. On EU divisions, I mean, it certainly matters inside the EU. In other words, I think that the Nordic-Baltic willingness to stake out stronger positions is a kind of warning sign to the EU. What I was struck with in the various interviews that I've done on this is how they're not even trying to influence the European Union. They've given up on trying to make the EU more progressive. So, it's not like anybody's going to tear down the EU or do anything stupid like Brexit. But I'm just struck by the fact that you've got multiple voices now coming from the Europeans in human rights, and so it might not impair the credibility of the EU directly, but certainly as a kind of a washing away, right? Kind of an erosion of some of its credibility to speak. Certainly from within the European Union. Externally, the EU has always had to fight for credibility in multilateral fora, including on human rights. I've written on this before several times. The EU is kind of damned if it does and damned if it doesn't. when it speaks out strongly on an issue, then it's in the Human Rights Council, it is almost immediately sparked a kind of a knee-jerk reaction by other groups, including the Africa group and the OIC, who are just, it's going to be anti-European. And this is very tough. This has always been very tough for the European Union when the United States is not there. Frequently in the Commission on Human Rights in the 1990s, or in the going even further back, the US was often isolated. So the Europeans could kind of join with the crowd in kind of being sort of isolating the United States. That then stopped when the US just absented itself. And so the Europeans were left exposed, holding the kind of can for the West, as it were. And so any West versus the rest of the world kind of debates ended up being the rest of the world versus Europe. And that has always been particularly uncomfortable for the European Union in terms of both finding unity and then finding a way to kind of counter that. So EU credibility internally, I think, has been damaged by these divisions. I mean, internally, it's been damaged by the divisions coming from more conservative states, but then also obviously from these more progressive states. And then externally, you could say the EU has always tried to fight for credibility. So any internal divisions that are manifested are not going to be helpful. I hope that answers your question. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Karen, I salute Professor Monica Fedeli, the Pro-Rector. She joined us now. We will give the floor soon. But first, there were some questions that were for Manfred about Wolfgang, okay, transitional justice issues, the involvement of victims in consultations and so on.
Yeah. Thank you very much. If I understand the question, thank you. It's about victim participation in transitional justice. And that is a big issue. If I'm looking at the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, we, for example, in doing our fact-finding, we had to find access to victims, which we got through various civil society organizations, like also a network of such organizations dealing with the documentation of war crimes. But the question is, when you interview victims, you should do that in a very professional way, not to re-victimize the person. And what is happening at the moment is that many organizations would like to contribute to the identification of war crimes, and therefore there is not a well-functioning, coordinated approach. The Ukrainian government would rather keep it for themselves because they say it's our responsibility. We have also the necessary investigators and prosecutors, but in practice, they do not have the necessary capacity to deal with the up to 40,000 cases which we see so far. And I would like to flag an issue which is very much debated at the moment, namely some organizations and countries lobby for the establishment of a special court which would look into in particular into the crime of aggression, meaning Putin, but cannot actually deal with the case without having him in court. So my feeling is that also that might be important. It is really a question of whether it is worthwhile to put millions into a project which might fly or might also not fly, whereas at the same time, we have not enough investigators, prosecutors, and so on. And the same countries which are called upon to put money into that project are also called upon to second investigators, prosecutors to help with capacity building in Ukraine to deal with this multitude of cases. And I think for the purpose of fighting impunity and establishing accountability, that money would be better invested for the time being in dealing with this large number of cases, and that might also have a stronger preventive effect. But victim participation is more than that. For example, in the context of Bosnia-Herzegovina, the ICTY, the International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia, and so on, we have seen that victims were kind of exploited also, that they were hoping, so to say, to get compensation. But in the end, they found themselves, their cases being made public. So they had consequences of this type, and they did not get compensation because the courts tradition, in most cases, say that our finding is compensation enough. And in particular, in the case of the genocide of Srebrenica, where the international community was also involved, it took many years until, for example, the Dutch government was ready to give at least some compensation, and the international community, the UN, until today did not. So these victims are indeed in a very vulnerable situation from the beginning towards the end of the transitional justice process. And I fully share the opinion of those who say we need to do more to strengthen the situation, the position of victims. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that probably victims, until victims don't become citizens in the state where they had been victimized, this issue of making them participating and so on and so forth can be solved. And the international community can have a stake in this, but it's definitely something that must be addressed at the national level and in the community, at the community level, maybe even more precisely. I'm pleased to give the floor to Professor Fedeli. You can sit here. This is the extra chair.
Many people. So good morning, everybody. As Vice-Rector for the third mission and relations with the territory, with the local territory, I'm really honored to welcome you all in UniPD, also on behalf of our rector, that after 800 years is a woman. So I would like also to call her rectress. Okay, so, and this conference is really significant and requires our full attention to be able to respond critically to the horrors of the war and to promote the values of peace and respect from human rights. So we are here to reaffirm the university's commitment to supporting dialogue among minorities, the weak, that really deserve a life of dignity without conflict. So the peace is possible. Let's not resign ourselves to war. These were the words of yesterday that Pope Francisco told to the audience. So the University of Padova has really a long history of commitment to social justice and human rights. For example, you all know, and we are here hosted by the Center of Human Rights. The center is offering a lot of programs, opportunities, organizing events for all our community, locally, and nationally and internationally. This is really for us an important catalyst for the dialogue and for the achievement of the goals of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The aim of the university, together with the center, is really to create an accountable and inclusive institutions that fights against war, injustice, crime, poverty, and promotes inclusion. Establishing lasting peace is a task of education. All politicians can do is to keep us out of war. This is a quote of Maria Montessori. She is a pedagogist and educator, but she was also one of the first women in Italy that got a master's degree in medicine. So the third mission, or rather, or better maybe, social impact, represents a strategic dimension of the university and aimed at the development and implementation of policies, projects, action that have an economical, cultural, educational impact on citizens and society. This mission is understood as a transformation and improvement that are generated to fight against social, territorial, economical differences and inequalities. University of Padova intends to develop and promote a solid alliance between the university and society, based on the assumption that the academic institutions represent a common asset for the peace of the humankind. A central policy of the third mission is aligned with the 2030 goals for sustainable development. So all areas of these sustainable goals are very much interconnected and cross-cutting all third mission fields of action, such as knowledge enhancement research, public engagement, sustainable development, artistic and cultural heritage, public health, and continuing education. Governance, departments, students, faculty, and staff are all involved in this direction and pursuing these goals. This important conference demonstrates our support to this mission that is written in our DNA as public institution, open to all and emancipated to the missions of research, teaching, third mission, and service. So really, I want to thank all the attendees of this conference, students, scholars, public administrators, content experts, practitioners who came here and are willing to blend their perspectives and worldview for creating a better place in the world to live and develop together. Finally, I'm concluding reminding to the audience that University of Padova was established 2022 in the sign of freedom of a group of students that left Bologna and came to Padova to look for freedom, for more freedom in their study and research. And the motto of the university is Universa Universis Patavina Libertas, liberty of Padova universally and for all. This means that the university promotes the development of a culture based on universal values, such as human rights, peace, environmental protection, and international solidarity. Thank you. Please.
And since this conference is called The Consequences of War, I would like to ask you a question. Is it the consequence of the war in Ukraine that 2,400 students are left without scholarship of the regional Veneto? 2,400 students were promised and they were eligible and there is nothing, no explanation. And you are saying that the University of Padua is fighting against the social injustice. And is it fair that you left us like that without no explanation? And yes, there are no money, but there is no support. And this is mentally very hard when you're eligible and you have no explanation, no support, nothing. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I think that I know quite good the situation, and I can understand. This is not maybe true 100% that we left you without explanation, and we are very much committed in this situation and the funding that we are not receiving anymore for the region. And that's really, so I'm really, I can understand your point, but that doesn't mean that we are not open to a kind of dialogue and to see how and if in a certain way we can work together in this direction. I know, and we were aware about this direction, but this is really, so we don't have this kind of funds because the region is not supporting this this scholarship like in the last years. And you know, I don't think that there is always a white and a black, but we have to try and really to blend perspective in this sense and not to become rigid on these two different positions. This is the only thing that I can do now, and I can tell you now in this situation. And I'm really happy that you brought this issue in this audience. Thank you.
Yeah. To support the position of students and to support also the position of the university in this specific context, definitely. Yeah, I think this is this sort of you know, consequences that maybe can be related to in general the situations that we are facing as a state, as a local community, and also as a community of scholars in this university. So we are all together try to face, you know, these problems that are exactly the problems we are trying to address in this meeting. This conference is a research conference, so I remind you that in the afternoon we have 6 parallel panels. Okay, there are 2 venues for the panels. One is this place, this very room, where you will deal with the panels on consequences of war on migration, current legal and political and policy challenges, and then interdisciplinary perspectives on specific aspects of forced migration. So if you are interested in migration, just stay. Okay. The other panels are at the headquarters of the Human Rights Center, which is not far from here. You just have a look at some of us, some of the locals. We will go there. It's not far actually, and in case there is the exact, you know, the address on the back of your program, and the panels there will be again in 2 rounds. One starting at 2:30, and the next, the following at 4:15. And the topics that he will be addressed in these panels include consequences of war on the communities, the environmental consequences of war, the consequences of the war in Ukraine for Europe, and then my panel, which is the consequences of war on accountability for international crimes. So I hope to see all you in the panels soon. Thank you. Thanks to the speakers for their engaging, you know, speeches and comments. Thanks to Karen Smith, who is still with us. Thank you also for, you know, affording this, you know, remote engagement. Thanks to Wolfgang Benedek, and thanks to Jan Frey for their contributions. Thank you very much, and see you later. Yeah.